Here's what you missed this week on The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from the United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa. You might know me on Iowa Catholic Radio from being the host of the Catholic Morning Show. Over yonder, Bud Marr. What do people know you from?
I'm the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the college.
And I want to say all of that's false. What people know you for is you were in Rome because you got to do something really cool. You got to be at the Mass in which St. John Henry Newman was made Doctor of the Church, and you got to speak at the Gregorian. So stop lying, Bud. People know you because of that, which is really awesome. How's it feel to be back home after your Rome visit?
Yeah, it was a really cool week. The weather on the day of the Mass was beautiful. Pope Leo gave a wonderful homily. So St. Peter's Square was packed that day, I think. Strong devotion to Newman. But it also felt good to make it back with the shenanigans going on in our government. I know this week that flights have gotten a lot more locked up. So I feel like I made it back into the States like right in the nick of time.
Oh, well, we're glad that you did. We're also glad that Imogene Ingredients underwrites our show. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients. It is a privilege to get to represent you here on Iowa Catholic Radio. Bud, what are we going to be talking about today? You got a burr under your saddle you want to bring up.
Right. So one thing we've done on the show is when we have talks coming up or conferences, whatever, we sort of like preview the topic for our listeners. So this weekend as the show is airing, I'll be speaking at to men in formation for the diaconate. And so this is a little conversation I'm having with deacons in formation, talking to them about church history and a Catholic understanding of church history. So I appreciate you letting me air this out on the show.
Absolutely. It's The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting it. I'm going to let you set the table for our conversation today as it pertains to you and a talk you'll be given this weekend, maybe while the show is playing.
Right. So talking to deacons in formation about church history. And I don't know about you, Bo, but I grew up in a context where there wasn't a lot of attention to church history. It wasn't anything nefarious or ill-minded. It was just that there was a real strong focus on the Bible. And so when we got to Duke, for me, a lot of that was brand new. I had heard of Augustine, sort of like some Catholics talk about Thomas Aquinas, but these figures like Ignatius of Antioch, Anselm, on down the line throughout the Middle Ages and up, even post-Reformation, were all really new to me. But I think that's all important stuff. Now, not all of us have ample time to dive deep into church history. But as Catholics, of course, we revere the saints, and our theology has been shaped by history or shaped in history. And so I think even when, subconsciously, we don't, even when we don't recognize that there are these influences and factors, for Catholics especially, history is vital. It's really important. So to set the table, I kind of wanted to throw out an idea for you. I'm going to talk to the deacons in formation about this. When I was in graduate school, the next stage,
real quick, asterisk here. It's funny, just all you parents out there, if you deprive your kids of history, they end up getting PhDs in church history, which is what Bud did. I just want to point out, it's hilarious. You're talking about grad school. So it's funny that one of the things that led you to do what you did at St. Louis University, historical theology, is precisely because of this lack, right, of a sort of historical understanding of ecclesiology. So just a little bit of bio that I think we should have put in there.
Wasn't that part of your journey? You're at Oklahoma State and you see the philosophers having a grand time and you're like, I got to join that party.
I was actually weirder than that. I wanted to be a philosopher in high school.
Oh, wow.
But that's because, the story goes, and it's true, I read about Socrates, and that, he in the Apology, he goes, the state is like a great steed, and he said, so the soul is as well, and the philosopher is like a gadfly that bites the steed to wake it up from its slumber, and when I realized that you could be a professional pain in the butt, I knew what job I wanted. So that's how I became a philosopher.
What's funny is we're getting a little bit down a bunny trail here, but my senior year, I was set to study business at Dana College in Blair, which no longer operates. It's a disc golf course now.
You dodged multiple bullets.
Well, maybe they missed out on a very wealthy alum, and I would have kept it alive. But I ended up.
That's awesome.
I ended up. You say if we deprive our kids of church history, part of my motivation to go to John Brown was, of course, I wanted to be at the same college Rachel was at.
Yeah.
And so there was like some romantic angle that God used to swing me towards theology. But we're talking about church history today.
That's Marr history.
That's Marr history.
Let's get back to church history.
So church history. There was a professor in graduate school, actually my mentor, Ken Parker, and he had this, like, he called it like a heuristic device. And what he meant by that is sort of a framework. It's not the end-all, be-all of understanding these things, but this is sort of, like he said, a helpful way to think about how we read church history. So real quickly, he had 4 ways that he thinks like theologians kind of go about this. He talked about a successionist model, supersessionist, developmental, and a perceptionist. So like I said, real quickly, with the successionist, that's this kind of idea that our faith, the deposit of faith, could almost be collected in a series of propositions, like that you could number. And these are sort of like, we think about truths of the faith, like God created the world. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when Christ was among us, he gave his apostles a certain set of teachings, and that's been passed down sort of unchanging since that time. That's different than the supersessionist model. The supersessionist model, it comes from the word like to supersede. So in that approach, the church today sort of leaps over part of history to get to a more pristine practice of the faith. This, of course, is really popular among Protestant believers who say, like, yes, like the apostolic faith was pristine and alive, but over time, through these various historical factors, what was passed down got burdened by accretions or corruptions. So to get back to the apostolic faith, you sort of have to leap over history. That's, there's a version of that that's in some Catholic circles. So I would say, like, what we call in the 20th century the ressourcement movement, it's not as on steroids as Protestantism, but it does kind of have this idea of, like, going back to earlier ideas and practices to kind of, like, shape how we think about things today.
Side note, I'll let you keep going. That would hurt so many ressourcement people's feelings to call them super.
I like some of the ressourcement guys.
No, I know. Just I'm imagining how many people you've made mad just saying that.
Going back to the sources.
Yeah.
So,
okay, developmental.
I think I'll start with a perceptionist before I gave it in different order. But the a perceptionist is this idea that there can be new knowledge today that corrects what we've received. So this one is, I would say, most in tension with Catholic thought. But it's this idea, so like, as St. Paul was writing about marriage and family life or the role of women, he's writing with a first century mindset, sort of like within his own cultural context. There's things that it's claimed, know about the human person today that St. Paul didn't, and therefore, this gets into sort of like how we understand the inspiration of Scripture, but there's parts of the Bible that are no longer binding on us today. Even if that's...
If you've tuned in, we're not...
I'm not endorsing this. You can... I don't know. So we'll critique that in a bit, but just to give listeners like an idea that this isn't just like totally insane, you think about something like in Paul's letters, he instructs women to wear head coverings during worship. And in most Catholic churches today, that's not a practice. We could talk about the validity of that practice, but it's just this idea that, like, what Paul is saying there is not really binding in the same way on us today that it was for the people he was writing to. It's conditioned
by its time so much that, like, that's the line of argument. Yeah. Okay. Now, developmental.
The developmental model, and of course, I'm a fan of this one. I've written on St. John Henry Newman. We can come back and say, like, in the show, though, but I'd like to talk about, like, good ways of understanding this. But the developmental model says that the deposit of faith that Christ gave to the apostles is objective, and Newman said immutable. It's unchanging in a certain sense. But the church's understanding of the faith deepens and expands over time. So there are theological articulations, so statements that recent popes and councils have made that were truly different than what was said before. Mm-hmm. But in Newman's developmental approach, it's not a rejection or a total alteration of what came before. It's stating a truth of the faith in the language and concepts that are popular today. I say popular, but like in the conceptual tools that are given to us in our giving time and culture. And so, I mean, we've talked about this some on previous episodes, but it's kind of this organic model, like an acorn grows into a large tree. The tree is truly a development of the acorn, even though it's, vastly different in its appearance and shape. Now, if you took the tree and you chopped it up and you turned it into a desk, that would be a kind of substantive change where you say the desk came from the tree,
right?
But there's something like substantively different about it. So it's kind of like this. I've written an analogy that I think others have found helpful, where the church's reception of the faith is sort of like a person sitting in a room early in the morning. They make an initial description of the room, and then as the sun rises, continue to describe the room. Those later descriptions will have greater specificity and detail, but those earlier ones aren't wrong if the person, gave them accurately. They're just not as developed as what he's able to say later.
I don't know if you want to jump immediately to this, but something in the news that we dealt with on the Catholic Morning Show, because it happened this week, actually, to my mind, will clarify these 4 differences. And so this is the doctrinal note on Marian titles. Mm-hmm. And so what you have there, right, is you start to have this question of not only do you have titles that weren't used in the past, but then you have a dicastery, and very clearly want to point this out, not saying they're heretical or anything, talking about their usefulness in theological discourse because of certain things. Okay. What's interesting about this is if you look at these 4, they take very different ideas about what that note that just happened is. So, for instance, the cessationist model has a problem because they might say this never happens. But clearly, right, this is something that in the Sensus Fidelium, the people of God came up with this title, and it's not, again, very much so saying, it's not that it's in quote-unquote bald error or heresy, but that the magisterium goes, look, there's a lot of qualifications that have to be said, and so that makes it difficult to use. That's the argument of this document. Yeah. So secessionists seem to have a problem with what actually happens a lot, like you're a historian, through history. The church has done this a lot, where things have sort of come up, and the church has to say, no, this isn't the best way to talk about stuff, regardless of even talking about heresy. The aperceptionist model is oh, you just do this all the time, right? And you can make whatever change that needs to happen. But we're living through this now, and I think the faithful would rightfully buck against this idea if we're saying no, we were just flat out wrong when there was things like Belgium had a mass that used these titles. The supersessionists, right? They are going to act like, oh no, what you need to keep doing is finding this more pure interpretation, which again is this big problem because we go well, so do we have any confidence right now that what's happening is going to continue in the future? I think the developmental model alone has a really good way to put this, Bud. It's like pruning a tree. Mm-hmm. So it's not like what was happening here was any way wrong. The idea is going forward as these things develop, there are branches that, again, it's not even that they're bad. It's that we prune them so that, as it were, the main trunks keep spreading and growing.
Yeah.
And so we can live with a world where we can admit, okay, there might be titles or there might be ways that we talk about things that the church, in her wisdom, with her magisterium, growing through time, can be more precise without having to throw out all babies with all bathwater. Do you think that's a good way to sort of get at what's different between all 4 of those versions?
Yeah, I like how you use that contemporary discussion to kind of flesh that out. If, sometimes on the show, I do get a little bit worried, if someone tunes in right now, they're like, oh, does Bud just want to talk about this heady stuff that he studied in graduate school? But I do think the conversation we're having today, it's really pertinent to all of our lives. At the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, there was an American Jesuit, John Courtney Murray, who said development was the issue underneath every issue at the council. So he thought as the bishops gathered there, were having this conversation, the question of what's a legitimate development was really the driving factor behind so many of the discussions. Mm-hmm. And I would say that's the case today with our reception of the faith. Now, we don't have to, every time a pastoral letter comes out, we don't have to be is this development? Where do I see successionist operative in this letter?
Right.
But it's what we're kind of wrestling with. So when we think about the church's witness in the world today, whether that's some pro-life issues that we have, how do we talk it to our youth about like sort of the diversity they see around them, religious pluralism, all these sorts of things? Like these are the kind of topics that can honestly be sort of trying for Catholics, right? Like people get into arguments about, well, this political party, like they support capital punishment or whatnot. Can I still vote for them as a Catholic, et cetera? And we have these kind of like the church's statements on those matters across time. It's like, how do I square this with that? Now, reassuringly, this isn't new issues for us. Sometimes we can feel like the modern world is like particularly trying.
Yeah.
But if folks aren't familiar with it, think about some of the Christological statements from the early church.
Oh, absolutely.
You go back to the Arian crisis, this question of like whether the Son of God was truly divine. People are arguing about this in the streets. And this is where I think the developmental model first really kind of stands out, because to guard what the church was teaching about the faith, there had to be, once, like we say it every Sunday at Mass, that the Son of God is consubstantial with the Father. At the time, homoousios. That's a brand new articulation. Like, theologians...
In terms of, like, using that word.
Yeah, in that sort of way, in a creedal statement.
Correct, yes. Even if the theological reality, we want to say, was there at all moments, waiting to be expounded upon.
Yeah.
Like you said, with that new light of, like, of a sun that's raised further. But what I think of historically, because I think sometimes even the supersessionist models do this. They'll go like, oh, well, the patristics and the creedal fights, those were good, but now we did it wrong for a lot of history. What I've learned from, Russell Hittinger, my mentor, about this is we've actually had long-standing developmental arguments that have spanned so for instance, I noticed this with teaching students this week. No one really talks about the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, like modern-day Germany. That thing was 1,000 years run.
Yeah.
800 from Charlemagne into the 1800s. Some form of the Holy Roman Empire existed. And the reason that's important for the church is nearly all of it was an argument with the Pope about what a state is. All of the sort of big things, man, like the Westphalia, the 30 Years' War. I mean, you get into like multiple things in church history, and the majority of them are about this outgrowth of what does it mean for the church and the state to coexist against each other. So, to your point, like with John Courtney Murray, I mean, this one that's like obviously with Vatican II, is people will get in a tizzy about dignitates humanae, which is very much about what do you do with religious pluralism in a state. So confessional states are not the thing anymore. And so people go like, well, what you need to do is just what the church did for all of time. And I'm like, hold your horses, buddy. I want you to go read what the church was saying with Charlemagne in 800, verse Gregory VII was talking about in the investiture controversy, verse there's all sorts of ways along that path where there's a seed that has always been the same, but as you said, had to be developed and pruned, which doesn't mean that we had to go back on what we said, but that we had to prune ways of talking about the church-state relation. And by the time we get dignitates humanae, I mean, there are literally forms of government that simply didn't exist before then. Yeah. And so that demanded talking about, like you said, the room of this topic with new light being shown through the windows.
Yeah, the popes in the 19th and early 20th century, they're seeing formally you could call them confessional Catholic states with a majority Catholic population where the authorities had been at the very least cognizant of the Catholic tradition, if not sort of guided by it in some way. And so as the papal states and things are conquered, they're, popes and others are rightfully pushing back and saying this sort of aggressive secularism that wants to eviscerate, all of Catholic culture, this is a real problem. By the time we get to the 1960s and the Second Vatican Council, of course, a lot of bishops at the council, they're attuned to the status of Catholics in countries where they're a minority population, persecuted by totalitarian governments.
Absolutely.
And they want to rightfully say something about the prerogative of those persons to be able to worship.
Correct.
If you would have just said, like, well, what this Pope said in the 19th century, all that we can do is sort of restate what he said at that time. The council wouldn't have been able to address that situation.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying it's easy.
No.
And there are times, like, you think about some of the recent debates that have come up. Like, I don't want to get into some things this morning, but like something like Amoris Laetitia, like the pastoral care of Catholics who have remarried, like that kicked up like a dust storm. And there was a lot of debate about, like, how do we walk this line?
Right.
But what I'm saying is, like, we can't close it off. There are so many examples that I could give. Recently I've been having some conversations with Catholics about biological evolution and sort of like, this is what science has said in recent decades. How do we square that with some elements of the faith? And you talk to persons who say, like, well, the church fathers said X and, like, we can't depart from that. No, I don't want, I'm not out trying to, like, disagree with Augustine. What Augustine actually said is more complex than they let on.
Absolutely.
But just to close down, like, for the church not to engage that science,
yes,
it would be a real poverty for the
right.
church.
It would be like to act like you can talk about an issue as if microscopes still don't exist, which is not to say that, like, again, that it would be even silly to talk about the patristics being wrong. Like, conversely, right, when secular people talk about, like, oh, Tertullian was wrong, I'm like, what, about chemistry? I'm sorry that he didn't understand, like, molecular, levels and electrons. But the point that I'm getting at, too, right, is we just got done. We had a great episode in October about how this sort of exact thing about the church having to deal with a situation it never dealt with before bears, like, again, I like this, about flowers into fruit that we didn't expect. So again, October being the month of the Rosary is because Leo the 13th was dealing with the captivity of the Vatican, right? Like him and Pius IX, the first sort of popes to deal with not having papal states. Yeah. And it would be silly if all Leo the 13th ever did was just being like, we should have papal states, we should have papal states. But by the time even of his papacy, he started to say, look, if God has, in his providence, taken the papal states away from us, and essentially that's what was occurring, the question behooves us to ask, what does that development mean? And what doesn't mean, right, is, well, we were wrong all along, but that whatever is true in seed form blossoms under these new sediments, these new conditions. Yeah. We got about a minute and a half or so before we hit into the next segment. So with these four,
right,
are you planning to, are the deacons going to need to, like, tattoo this on their forearm and be able to repeat this? No, I'm kidding.
It won't be on the midterm exam, but it's sort of helpful to have it in the back of your mind, like, as men who are going to be going into ministry, because they're going to be having conversations sometimes where these kind of live issues will enter the conversation. Now, at that point, I don't think the deacons should, like, break out their flashcards and teach the faithful these four models. But I think the models, like, shout out to my mentor, they give us a helpful way to kind of, like, start the conversation. And actually, during the second half of this retreat, what I'm going to talk about a great deal is the historical details of the Protestant Reformation.
Nice.
We already threw out Arianism. That sounds like really shots fired. But, like, the thing about it is, like, let's just say heresy in general, so heterodox ideas about the faith, they push the church to articulate what it really believes. I know we're getting close to the break, but I think even someone like Martin Luther, or especially someone like Martin Luther, he was trying to uphold certain truths of the faith. In doing so, he kind of overwhelmed or
flooded the zone,
undermined important other truths. And so I'm going to show how, like, the concerns of the Protestant Reformation actually bring into relief important things that Catholics believe.
No, I mean, and again, folks, I think one thing to say is, when you listen to our show, and I understand we've always tried to get at that sort of middle voice. We're not trying to give people college degrees, but we're trying to go beyond maybe the sort of catechetical instruction. This is mostly for you to chew on, right? And I think this is why it's good with deacons and clergy that are going to have to, give homilies or, like, explain things to people, that if you take time out of your formation to chew on what do we mean about history and how does the church's theology impact what we think history looks like, that this is extremely profitable and will bear fruit in your ability to convey the truths of the faith to the Catholic faithful. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to our show. Wonderful to have you with us. Thank you, Imogene Ingredients, for underwriting our show. Bud, we are diving deep in history, which makes sense coming off of the buzz of being over in Rome, when John Henry Newman declared Doctor of the Church, co-patron of education. So it makes sense we're going to come back and get some edumacation about history. Makes perfect sense to me. So let's keep it rolling along. What are we going to get to next?
Right. Just real quick about Newman. I'm not very ambitious or strategic, but I feel like with my theological interests, like landing on Newman in 2014 was like, it was gold.
That's right. Like that. You know what? Not to make it too personal, but I feel like the luck you had with Nebraska Cornhusker football migrated into your choice with Newman. The Newman choice has been just coming up spades, national championship level after national championship level. So maybe that's what you need to think every time, Bud, that like Nebraska's not quite doing it. You know, they both start with N. So maybe that's it. Is like your luck shifted to Newman.
The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Now that we're mentioning this on air, I'd like to do some research. I wonder what the narrowest gap between someone being named a saint and then a doctor of the church, because for Newman it was 6 years, almost, not to the date, but 6 years and 2 weeks, something like that.
That would be interesting, especially since like the further you go back into the church with their declaration of doctors, it's sort of
Anyways, so we're talking today about church history. We gave a sort of framework to think about this in the first half of the show. The thing about frameworks is if you stop with frameworks, people will be really bored and they won't know what you're talking about. So during the first half, the first segment there, we talked about this successionist model, the supersessionist, the aperceptionist, and the developmental. And you and I, Bo, both kind of tipped our caps to the developmental as probably the most helpful way to tackle this. Although the others, except for maybe the aperceptionists, give us kind of some tools to work with.
Hat tipped.
Yes, right. During that first segment, I mentioned the Arian controversy as one example of this sort of like taking place. But more recently, and I think one that I landed on because it played a huge role in my life, is like the Protestant Reformation. So we all know 16th century, this group of figures, most prominently Martin Luther, arose. They're concerned about certain corruptions in the church, or like even theological statements at a certain point in the history. And so they start what they call a reform. They work to change and make things better. Now, historians are keen to point out that Luther didn't begin thinking, I'm going to start a new thing. He's an Augustinian friar, so he's an ordained priest. He's totally embedded within the church. And his initial kind of conversations about this are like, I'm just going to reform the church in the same way that other great reformers in the past have done.
A letter was making it around social media, in fact, but to make this point that him regretting posting the 95 Thesis publicly because he goes, he meant it like just to be towards sort of other academic nerds.
Yeah.
And he said that it started to get out of control. Thank you, Printing Press. But anyway, your point, very salient. It was not like he foresaw the Reformation and he said, yes, so that's what I want to do.
That's a great point, and I think you would have fit well during that time period, because when we hear that Luther posted the 95 Theses, I think we have in mind that he like rented out a billboard.
Yeah, or like Facebook post.
This is how you started disputations, and we could go down a bunny trail with, like we've talked about, technological ecologies. Yeah. It's really with the printing press, coming into its own during that time period, that this posting of the theses, which would have normally started an academic disputation, really spread like wildfire.
Absolutely. And so, again, that you talk about a development that could not be foreseen.
Yeah.
And so to think of history as like merely genetic and mechanically handing on is to misread the sort of like way that an environment can become, a niche environment can become the dominant one overnight due to unpredictable change.
When reading about Luther's life, what struck me though, Bo, is how much his own kind of personal spiritual journey played into his theology. Mm-hmm. So I didn't fully realize when he became, like when he entered the monastery, this was really the result of a rash vow. according to his own
Yeah.
narrative of things. So he's caught in a thunderstorm. He's riding back to his own village, gets caught in this terrible thunderstorm, and he cries out to St. Anne that if his life will be spared, he'll become a monk. And there was a real sadness about him when he joined the monastery. Like he's telling his friends, like, the Luther will no longer be. When he actually becomes a monk, he really struggles.
Friar.
Yeah, friar. Thank you.
Yeah,
he really struggles with feelings of like personal guilt and not being. He's a very disciplined friar, so he's engaging in all sorts of ascetical disciplines and other things, but he never really feels like fully at peace in God's presence. Now, from there, my read, Bo, and maybe this is unfair, but I think he takes that and he projects it onto St. Paul. Because he reads St. Paul in Romans, who quotes Habakkuk and says, the just man shall live by faith. Mm-hmm. Catholics had been reading this verse for centuries, of course. Luther reads this, and it's kind of this light bulb moment for him, and he says, the key is not in any way us trying to make ourselves pleasing to God, but that the just man shall live by faith. Faith is totally a gift. Later in the Reformation, these theologians say it's a gift that's imputed to us.
Right.
So it's an external reality that's kind of like sort of embedded in us.
I have a hard time reading Luther charitably, to be honest. So one of the psychological reads that like I think is true, even if it's not like the primary thing we should do, is he gets really hung up on works of it.
Yep.
And you go like, yeah, because you made a rash vow. And like a vow is like the closest thing to like his sort of like idea of like a sort of punitive legalistic work, right? I made a vow, so I'm going to like live it out. And so what's one way to get out of a vow, bud? Well, say that like none of the works matter and all that matters is faith. Like it seems like he was, speaking of reading uncharitably, I think he was like reading towards a conclusion. Mm-hmm. Like he didn't feel right in this life, which is funny because if you just go back to casuistry at the time, you could get out of nearly any vow if it was a rash one.
Yeah.
Right? Like that was standard ethical principle in medieval Catholicism. Any rate, sorry.
In fact, you really shouldn't follow a rash vow, right?
Correct, right. Like you're
a rash
told
vow,
not to.
yeah. So it ends up being a perfect storm. That's kind of like the historical background or the life background to this whole story. Luther, so this is taking place as he's teaching the book of Romans and Galatians and the Psalms. He comes to what he considers this like great revelation. Around the same time or a couple of years later, he gets caught up in this. I was just hanging out with Englishmen. They say controversy. Yeah. He gets caught up in this controversy around indulgences. Mm-hmm. Now, Luther, when he writes about this, he actually doesn't reject the idea of purgatory or even of indulgences in principle.
Yeah.
But he's bothered by some of the practices surrounding them. So at that,
probably right. I mean, rightly so in particular instances. Yes.
What like the selling of indulgences, we could nuance that conversation, but there were things that were being done that Catholics today and that Trent Reformed would say like we're not really supposed to have been doing.
Yes.
But Luther, like this is where he has this post in the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses is kind of like set of arguments around these practices. That starts a whole debate about indulgences and purgatory in general. The way this flows back into the previous conversation is that Luther begins to read the Catholic theology of purgatory through this sort of like understanding that he's developed around faith and works.
Well, and also like the practices of his time, mm-hmm. which are very distinct even. Anyway, keep going, sorry.
Yeah, and so if the just man shall live by faith, if we're justified or made right by God through this gift that he imputes to us, like an external sort of reality, Luther says there must be like nothing that we bring to the table. Sola fide, sola gratia, even to the point where he starts to completely doubt human freedom. So he gets in this extended argument with Erasmus, a humanist, around whether human beings are free at all. The way this sort of like factors into this larger conversation that we're having about church history is you can see that Luther begins to doubt certainly a successionist, but even a kind of developmental understanding of the faith, where he says Rome has been taken over by the Antichrist. They're teaching a religion of works that is contrary to the true gospel. We have to go back and we have to recover this pristine understanding of the faith. And so the understanding of church history that Luther brings to the table and that his Catholic interlocutors bring to the table is not inconsequential. They're both trying to understand, like, how do we read and apply the scripture today? And Luther says, if you do so in the way that the Catholic Church or its present-day leaders are telling you to, you're going to miss the truth of the gospel.
You know what's interesting about this, too? I immediately think of, like, the pruning argument that I made about the Marian titles, because what needed to happen with the indulgences problem was a pruning, because it's not like, indulgences as properly understood, we still have them. And I would even argue the indulgences that, like, made Luther and many people the most angry were the indulgences tied directly to providing money to build buildings in Rome,
right?
Which was, like, the huge issue at the time. And I think that a developmental reformer who didn't want to break away from the church could go, look, of course, the deposit of faith allows there to be indulgences, and B, it's actually the case in all technicality that you could have indulgences be used to build buildings in Rome. But it's not useful because you have to have so many caveats and you have to fight against so many bad interpretations and abuses that you could have made that argument and not fall into Luther's trap. If you were developmental, you'd say, this is a practice that needs pruning, not a source that we've gone away from that we have to jump back over parts of history to get back to.
Yeah, and that's where, thinking about the Reformation is challenging as a Catholic. Like you were saying, it's difficult for you to read Luther charitably. It's been difficult for me prepping this talk to read about the Protestant Reformation and the fallout from it. It really starts this kind of domino effect where we get wrong-headed philosophical ideas, we get political revolutions. We don't want to connect these dots like too easily or simplistically, but I think every historian worth his salt will say, like, Protestantism played a role in sort of birthing the modern world.
Yes.
That being said, I think we can study it profitably. So you even look about Luther's statement, justification by faith, and Luther cracks me up because he's sort of like busting the chops of Catholic theologians and being like, you guys aren't biblical enough. He thinks, like he says, well, Scripture, and in some cases, it disagrees with popes and councils. And so if that's going to be the argument, Scripture has to win over popes and councils. When he gets his sort of like what he calls like the essence of the faith, like the one idea on which the gospel stands or falls, as he's going through his biblical translation, when he gets to Paul, when Paul talks about justification by faith, Luther adds the word alone.
And also
inserts that in there.
And punts St. James to the back.
Basically like the concordance or whatever.
Because it kind of doesn't
cuts
work
against the grain of his reading. But Luther is right in this sense. So I think he misunderstands parts of St. Paul. Again, this is where understanding of history can really help. What's Paul talking about like in the book of Galatians? Well, in the early church, this whole conversation kicks up. If a Gentile becomes a member of the people of God, what's required of that Gentile? And Paul says, because of the work that God has done in Jesus Christ, a Gentile who comes to faith in Christ does not have to adhere strictly to the laws of the Old Covenant. Doesn't necessarily have to be circumcised or follow like Jewish dietary laws. And so when someone like Paul says, for by grace we have been saved through faith, not by works, lest anyone should boast, like I think in that case we have to say, when he's talking about works, what is he talking about? Because in other parts of Paul's letters, he extols charitable works, right?
Working out your faith in fear and trembling. I mean, just go on and on.
So Luther doesn't, I think, see those dynamics at work. That being said, I think Luther is right to be concerned about what we could call a Pelagian approach to righteousness,
Correct.
Where we look at our own human capacities and say, well, maybe the calling for me is to try hard enough to apply enough elbow grease until I make myself like I'm satisfied in the sight of God, right? I'm ready and prepared for heaven. If we have that sort of understanding of works righteousness, Luther was right to reject it. And in that sense, his ideas about justification were pushing an important argument.
Yes. I mean, again, this goes back to one more time with history, an important argument spoken of again and again throughout church history. So, one of the things that surprises me in a lot of the Protestant Reformation, but this is me like trying to be fair about the significant capacity to read many more works because of the printing press again, as it keeps going. And I mean, like, look, the humanists like have done this, right? They started like translating Greek works and all these things like this, et cetera, et cetera. But I am often amazed about the sort of historical blindness about acting as if these questions had never been asked before. And I mean, and to be sort of accusatory, they all realize Augustine, because they had basically the whole corpus of Augustine. If I'm not mistaken, Bud, in terms of transmission history, the vast majority of everything we have of Augustine was mostly kept at all times. Like, I mean, maybe locally you had like City of God and not this, that, or the other, but Augustine's corpus largely available and commented on through church history. And clearly, he's worried about Pelagians. I mean, he brings it up. And even if we want to say that, like, we kind of think later Augustine overshot it, actually, and this is where Luther maybe gets some of his ideas about there being, like, no free will per se, the church has talked about this issue ad infinitum. And the Middle Ages had, like, semi-Pelagian controversies. I know that, like, the Renaissance did. So the sort of historical blinders, one more time, because you need to get back to this pure Christianity instead of being developmental and saying, well, how have we argued this when it reemerges, was a severe handicap in the Reformation debates.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Augustine. He's the one figure in the early church that the Protestants across the board almost universally revered. But Augustine is a case study in this whole conversation that we're having.
Oh, yeah.
Because Augustine wrote a great deal. And before he died, he actually had the opportunity to write these retractiones where he was able to say, like, at this time I wrote this, I affirm it wholeheartedly. He's like, I would say this a little bit differently today. So there's this massive corpus that you said had been largely preserved. And, you know, for instance, during the Pelagian controversy, I'm keep wanting to talk like the Queen's English. Yeah. During this controversy, Augustine, as he's kind of railing against Pelagius, has some strong statements about grace and faith. And if you isolate those statements and you make that sort of a determinative philosophy without seeing it within the entire context of church history, you're probably going to get it wrong.
I mean, Augustine writing against Faustus versus Augustine writing against Pelagius. And so that's like the sort of bookends of his public ministry as a theologian in the church. Completely different. I mean, not really, right? Like, we want to say, and I mean, even he, like, tries in the later of his life to show about, like, how there's that sort of continuity. But, like, it's certainly completely different tones that he's doing.
Yeah, and that's where this is probably the toughest part of Luther's theology for me to read, because he's wrestling with those ideas, and then he lands in a place where he becomes completely convinced of his own position, won't listen to the church, ultimately says, like, the papacy in its current form is the Antichrist. And then on top of that, he's so convinced of his position, I think by disposition, he's hyperbolic. So he starts to tell other, like, his followers, like, things like sin boldly, and that we're totally sinful and totally justified. He, whereas Catholic theologians in the past had talked about concupiscence, how original sin continues to exercise, it's kind of like a weight that pulls us towards the desire for sin. He sees that as like a sinful dynamic, like truly sinful. And so he says, like, well, God says that we're righteous, that we're justified in his sight, but as long as we're on this earth, we're still sinful. And I think he kind of just eviscerates the New Testament understanding of growth in faith and charity.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas, like, I mean, in the New Testament, like, in the book of Revelation, like, I think it's Revelation, maybe Hebrews, no impure thing should enter heaven.
No, yeah.
St. Paul tells us to be a living sacrifice, like, wholly set aside for the things of God. And so I think that's where later Lutherans can't really even conceive of saints in the way that Catholics do, because we say there are these certain individuals, not because they applied enough elbow grease, but because God's grace, like, was that effective and powerful in their lives that they became, totally sanctified. Even, like, some of them still wrestled with the desire for sin, of course, but even before their deaths, they had this kind of, like, indwelling of the Holy Spirit in such a way that they were, like, on fire for God on this earth.
I mean, a guy who started out his career having, like, such a devotion to Mary, to see, like, the sort of outgrowth of his ecclesiastical movements pretty much completely mute all Marian devotion, right? To set like a horse running and not knowing how to bridle it back.
Yeah.
But also to make a point, like the moment that Luther, without using these terms, like decided he wasn't an a-processionist and was actually supersessionist. Because I feel like at one point the momentum was like he really started imbibing a lot of revolutionary impulses himself. And then the peasants rose up. And he's like, oh, you got to kill the peasants.
Tone it down.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden he was like, oh, no. What we're doing is going back to an original order. And then even political-wise, he all of a sudden became... So it's interesting how much... This is where I think your point is really salient, bud. It's interesting with history how if you take on certain historical aspects, you can be very forward-looking by imagining a past that you say you're getting back to, but then also, like, politically being arch-traditionally conservative.
Yeah.
And that you see this play out in the 30 Years' War and all of these things like this, where people who are, like, arguing for Protestant princes, which is a new thing that never existed, are making arguments about, like, oh, well, what we're doing is going back to, like, the original meaning of what it means to be a king. It gets very confusing.
Well, this is where I think Luther was naive. You talk about the Peasants' Revolt, or how much time do we have left?
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah.
Some people call it the Farmers' Rebellion because it was sort of like a class slightly above the peasants. Luther, when he breaks with the church and he says, well, Scripture comes into conflict with popes and councils, and we just need to follow, like, the clear meaning of Scripture, he thinks that meaning is going to be obvious. And so Luther, not only, we've already talked about how he sort of like undermined the traditional Catholic understanding of salvation, but here he acts like you can do biblical interpretation outside of this living body that persists across time. When those around him, like the farmers or peasants, start to say, like, they're mesmerized with his challenge to authority and this kind of like nascent individualism, when they take those ideas and they apply them to start this political revolt, Luther's like, no, you're getting it all wrong.
Correct.
Well, that fissure is the first of many fissures
absolutely.
in this sort of like perpetual division that has characterized Protestantism ever since.
And he's like, no, you guys can't read the book. I can, because like I'm this privileged class. Anyway, like it's like let's liberate like the understandings away from the popes, but not for you guys. For me, the new pope, Martin Luther Pope.
Yeah, and so we've been dealing with the consequences ever since. Like, again, as I kind of started the show, like, we're all going to have like different amounts of time and energy to dive into church history, but I hope that this little sort of like brief run through the Protestant Reformation shows just how like, it's not always easy being Catholic. Like, these kind of conversations can have a lot of heat, like we can find them challenging at times, but there are these certain sort of pillars of the Catholic faith that are so important, not only during the time of the Reformation, but as we continue walking through history today.
This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, a romp through history, and I think your deacons are in for a fun treat. I want to say thank you to Imogene Ingredients one more time before we get into that, for underwriting the show and making such romps possible. But I do hope people come away with a sort of deeper understanding and appreciation of what the difference Catholic understanding of history makes.
Yeah, Bo, thanks for letting me talk about that some on the show. It's been a beautiful fall, kind of a late fall, and whenever I'm driving through rural Iowa, it's hard not to think about Imogene Ingredients. As you're driving or any time during your day, please join us in the prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. We pray the rosary on air quite early, 4:30. We do it at 10 a.m., 8:30 in the evening. The Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:57 p.m. But also, jump on the app. We've got a lot of great resources there, including the opportunity to pray the rosary using the app.
Absolutely. If you want to know what's going on in and around the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, go to iowacatholicradio.com and click on events. You can click on the business sponsor page to know which businesses you can go by and say thank you for making all of our local and national programming possible. But of course, you make it possible. It's your ministry as well, so make sure to prayerfully consider donating. You can do that by calling or texting 515-223-1150 or going to iowacatholicradio.com and clicking on the donate button to safely and securely donate to your Iowa Catholic Radio station. But as always, wonderful show, absolutely fascinating, and I really hope people truly are able to be grounded more in history with this discussion.
That was fun. Thanks, Bo.
This is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, in our family, our city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.